The gavel slammed down, echoing through the dusty Wyoming square. On the auction block stood a trembling 17-year-old girl, clutching a squalling newborn. She wasn't selling property, she was the property. And the only man standing between her and a cruel fate was a scarred mountain man who couldn't have children. The sun beat down on the miserable frontier town of Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory, in the brutally dry summer of 1881. Heat shimmered off the hard-packed dirt of the main thoroughfare, carrying with it the stench of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and horse manure. A crowd had gathered outside Hutchins' Mercantile, drawn like vultures to the spectacle unfolding on the wooden loading dock. At the center of the spectacle stood Josephine Clement. She was 17 years old, her calico dress practically rotting off her frail frame, her face smeared with trail dust and the tracks of silent tears. Clutched desperately to her chest, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, was a newborn baby boy named Samuel. He wasn't her son. He was the son of her older sister Alice, who lay buried in a shallow, rocky grave 3 weeks back on the Oregon Trail, a victim of childbirth and a sudden savage fever. Their father, William Clement, had succumbed to cholera a month before that, leaving Josie to carry the infant the rest of the way on foot after their oxen died. She had staggered into Bitter Creek, starving, desperate, and carrying a debt her father had supposedly incurred with Thaddeus Hutchins, the ruthless proprietor of the Mercantile, years prior. Hutchins, a man whose greed was legendary across the territory, produced a ledger with William Clement's forged signature, claiming a debt of $150. When Josie couldn't pay, Hutchins invoked an obscure localized debtor's law. He wasn't auctioning her off as a slave that was illegal. He was auctioning off her labor contract for a period of 10 years to recoup the debt. Every soul in Bitter Creek knew it was indentured servitude at best, and a horrific descent into abuse at worst. "Do I hear $40? Hutchins barked, his face flushed with the heat and the thrill of cruelty. He banged a wooden mallet against an overturned whiskey barrel. $40 for 10 years of strong, young labor. She can cook, she can clean, and the good Lord knows she'll do whatever else her master requires to pay off her poor dead daddy's sins." The crowd jeered and laughed. The baby, Samuel, let out a piercing, hungry wail. Josie tightened her grip, trying to shush him, her eyes darting like a cornered rabbit's. 45, slurred a voice from the front. It was Jebediah Rust, a local drunkard and prospector known for his violent temper and a string of mysteriously missing wives. He stared at Josie with a hunger that made her stomach churn violently. 50. "Thosrak," called out a woman from the brothel across the street, calculating the girl's worth in a different kind of labor. Standing at the absolute fringes of the crowd, shrouded in the shadow of the livery stable awning, was Arthur Pendleton. Men called him the Ghost of the Bighorns. He was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4", draped in tanned buckskin and a heavy bearskin coat despite the summer heat. A thick dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jawbone, a souvenir from a grizzly bear that hadn't survived the encounter. Arthur rarely came down from the high peaks. He despised the towns, the noise, and the cruelty of civilized men. He had only descended to buy winter salt, black powder, and coffee, but as he watched the scene on the loading dock, something ancient and painful twisted in his gut. Arthur had a secret, one that had eaten away at his soul for a decade. He was barren. A severe bout of mumps in his late adolescence had left him completely infertile. It was a truth that had shattered his young marriage 10 years ago, when his wife Sarah tearfully left him for a man in Denver who could give her the children she desperately wanted. Since then, Arthur had retreated from the world, punishing himself with isolation, convinced he was half a man, unworthy of a family. $60, Rust yelled, stepping closer to the platform, his yellowed teeth bared in a grin. But I ain't paying for the squalling brat. The whelp goes to the orphanage in Cheyenne, or you can drown it in the creek for all I care, Hutchins. I'm buying the girl." Josie screamed, a raw, primal sound that cut through the hot air. "No, please. He's my nephew. He's all I have. You can't take him. The baby is not part of the contract," Hutchins declared, slamming his mallet down. $60 from Mr. Rust. Going once. Arthur's massive hands clenched into fists. He saw the sheer terror in the girl's eyes. He saw the tiny helpless bundle in her arms. The very idea of a child being torn from its only family, of a young girl being handed over to a monster like Rust, broke the dam of his decades-long stoicism. Going twice, Hutchins raised the mallet. $200. The voice was low, gravelly, and boomed like distant thunder. The entire square fell dead silent. Heads snapped toward the livery stable. Arthur stepped out of the shadows, the sunlight catching the worn silver of the Colt revolver strapped to his thigh and the sheer, intimidating bulk of him. The crowd parted instinctively, clearing a wide path as he walked toward the loading dock. Hutchins blinked, his greedy eyes going wide. T200. "Mr. Pendleton, I need cash money, or gold. No pelts." Arthur reached into the deep pocket of his coat. He withdrew a heavy leather pouch and tossed it underhand. It hit the wooden barrel with a heavy metallic thud that made Hutchins jump. "That's raw bighorn gold," Arthur said, his voice barely above a rumble, yet carrying to everyone in the square. "Weighed it myself, near $300 worth. The debt is paid. The girl and the boy are coming with me." Rust stepped into Arthur's path, his hand hovering near his own rusted iron. "Now wait just a damn minute, Mountain Man. I won the bid. You can't just walk down here and—" Arthur didn't even break his stride. He simply turned his head, locking eyes with Rust. The look in Arthur's pale gray eyes was so devoid of warmth, so steeped in the untamed violence of the wild, that Rust physically recoiled, the color draining from his face. "Step aside, Jebediah," Arthur warned softly, "before I make you a permanent fixture of this dirt." "Da! Rust swallowed hard and backed away, his hands raised submissively. Arthur stepped up onto the dock. He didn't look at Hutchins, who was scrambling to untie the pouch and inspect the gold. Instead, he looked down at Josie. She was shaking so violently her teeth chattered. She looked at him as if he were the devil himself coming to claim her soul. "Come on, little bird," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a surprisingly gentle timbre. "Let's get you and the little one out of the sun." The ride out of Bitter Creek was silent and tense. Arthur had purchased a sturdy, gentle mare for Josie, practically lifting her and the baby into the saddle. He rode ahead on his massive draft cross, leading her horse by the reins. For the first few hours, Josie was paralyzed by fear. She had traded one nightmare for an unknown one. This man had paid a fortune for her. What did he expect in return? The stories she had heard of mountain men, that they were feral, savage beasts who lived like animals, played over and over in her mind. They climbed higher into the Bighorn Mountains. The oppressive, dusty heat of the plains slowly gave way to crisp, thin air, scented with pine and damp earth. The trail grew narrow, winding through towering spires of granite and dense, ancient forests. As dusk fell, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, they reached a clearing. Nestled against a sheer rock face, completely hidden from the valley below, sat Arthur's cabin. It wasn't a crude shack. It was a masterfully built structure of thick, notched logs, with a sturdy fieldstone chimney, a wraparound porch, and heavy shutters. A clear, icy stream babbled just a few yards from the front door. Arthur dismounted and helped Josie down. Her legs gave out the moment her boots hit the ground, the sheer exhaustion of the last month finally catching up to her. She collapsed into the dirt, clutching the baby, expecting a curse or a kick from her new master. Instead, a massive pair of arms gently scooped her up, baby and all. "I gotcha," Arthur muttered, carrying her inside. The interior of the cabin was remarkably clean. It smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and old leather. Arthur laid her down on a large bed covered in a thick, remarkably soft wolf pelt blanket. He then took the wailing infant from her weakening grip. Josie tried to protest, but her vision was swimming. "Rest," Arthur commanded softly. "I know my way around a crying babe." Over the next 3 days, Josie slipped in and out of a severe fever. The trauma of the trail, the starvation, and the emotional break of the auction had broken her immune system. She drifted in the haze, but whenever she opened her eyes, she saw the giant man tending to the fire, boiling willow bark tea, and feeding her weak broth. But the most shocking sight was how he handled little Samuel. Arthur had ridden down to a lower valley to trade with a local homesteader for goat's milk. Josie would wake in the middle of the night to see Arthur sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, a tiny, fragile bundle resting against his massive chest. He hummed old, deep baritone lullabies, feeding the baby from a makeshift bottle fashioned from a leather pouch and a hollowed reed. The man who looked like he could tear a tree from the earth by its roots was handling the newborn with the reverence of a priest holding a holy relic. On the 4th morning, Josie's fever broke. She sat up, wrapping the wolf pelt around her shoulders. Arthur was at the cast-iron stove, flipping flapjacks. "You're awake," he noted, not turning around. "Fever's gone, color's back in your cheeks." "Why did you buy me?" Josie blurted out, her voice raspy. I can work, Mr. Pendleton. I can clean this cabin. I can cook. But I won't be a wife to you. You can kill me first." Arthur stopped cooking. He slowly placed the skillet back on the heat and turned to face her. His eyes were deeply sad. "I ain't looking for a servant, Miss Clement. And I sure as hell ain't looking for a wife against her will." He gestured toward a crude wooden cradle he had carved over the last 3 days, where Samuel was sleeping soundly. "I bought your contract because no human being deserves to be sold like a draft horse. And because," he paused, swallowing hard, "because a child needs his family. But the money, the gold. You paid a fortune for me." "Gold is just rocks in the dirt up here," Arthur said softly. "It can't keep you warm. And it can't keep you company. You're free, Josie. Once you're strong enough, if you want, I'll ride you down to the rail station in Cheyenne, buy you a ticket anywhere you want to go. Or, if you have nowhere to go, you and the boy can stay as my guests until you figure things out." Josie stared at him, utterly stunned. You would just let us stay." "It gets mighty quiet up here in the winter," Arthur admitted, looking down at his boots. "Hearing another voice, hearing that boy cry. It's a good sound." Over the next month, an unspoken routine developed. Josie regained her strength. She insisted on helping around the cabin, mending Arthur's clothes, baking bread, and managing the small garden out back. Arthur spent his days hunting and preparing for the brutal Wyoming winter, but he always returned before dark, his eyes immediately seeking out the baby. Josie watched Arthur with a growing sense of awe and an unexpected blooming affection. She noticed the profound sorrow in him, a hollowness that only seemed to fill when he held Samuel. One evening, after a shared supper of venison stew, she finally asked him about it. Arthur, staring into the flickering hearth, finally revealed the truth. He told her about the illness of his youth, the agonizing revelation of his infertility, and the departure of his wife, Sarah. "I'm a dead branch on the family tree, Josie," he whispered, a tear catching in his thick beard. "I was meant to be alone. The Lord saw fit not to trust me with a child." Not. Josie moved from her chair and sat on the floor beside him. She reached out, her small calloused hand resting on his massive knee. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Arthur. You saved Samuel's life. You saved mine. If that isn't the work of a father, I don't know what is." For the first time in 10 years, Arthur Pendleton wept. But their peaceful sanctuary was an illusion. Down in Bitter Creek, greed was festering. Thaddeus Hutchins couldn't stop thinking about the pouch of raw gold Arthur had tossed on the barrel. He had hired Jebediah Rust and 3 other ruthless gunmen. It tracked Arthur's heavy horseprints up the mountain. A storm was rolling in over the bighorns, turning the sky a slate gray. As the first drops of rain hit the tin roof of the cabin, Arthur's head snapped up. His keen ears, trained by years of wilderness survival, caught a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the rain. It was the metallic clink of a spur right outside the cabin door. The metallic clink of a spur against the river stones outside the cabin cut through the drumming rain like a knife. Arthur Pendleton's demeanor transformed in a heartbeat. The gentle, melancholic man staring into the fire vanished, replaced instantly by the apex predator of the Bighorn Mountains. He raised a hand commanding absolute silence from Josie and silently moved toward the heavy oak door. He slid the iron deadbolt into place with a soft snick, then turned to the mantel, lifting his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle and a box of brass cartridges. "Josie," Arthur whispered, his voice a low, urgent gravel. "Take the boy. Get down into the root cellar under the floorboards. Do not come out until I open that hatch. Understand?" Josie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't panic. The frontier had already burned the fragility out of her. She scooped the sleeping Samuel from his wooden cradle, wrapped him tight to muffle any potential cries, and pulled the braided rug aside. She lifted the heavy trapdoor, descending into the dark, earth-smelling cellar, surrounded by jars of preserved peaches and cured venison. As Arthur lowered the door above her, plunging her into pitch blackness, she heard the first shout. Pendleton. It was the slurred, ugly voice of Jebediah Rust, barely carrying over the storm. "We know you're in there, you feral bastard. Hutchins sent us to collect his rightful property. Hand over the girl, the brat, and the rest of that gold you're hiding, and we'll let you freeze to death in peace." Inside the cabin, Arthur moved like a ghost. He didn't bother answering. He knew men like Rust didn't negotiate, they slaughtered. Peering through a narrow gap in the heavy window shutters, Arthur counted 4 shapes in the driving rain. Rust and 3 hired guns from Bitter Creek, Roth men known locally as Deacon Miller, Free Fingers Jack, and a ruthless Pinkerton deserter named Wyatt. They had rifles raised, fanning out in a semicircle around the front porch. "Last chance, mountain man," Wyatt barked, cocking his Winchester. Arthur's response was a deafening roar from the Sharps rifle. The heavy .50 caliber slug tore through the heavy wooden shutter, instantly shattering the collarbone of Three Fingers Jack, sending the man flying backward into the mud with a wet scream. All hell broke loose. A barrage of return fire ripped into the cabin. Lead chewed through the thick log walls, shattering plates and tearing through the wolf-pelt blankets. Down in the cellar, Josie curled herself around Samuel, praying the thick floorboards would hold. Her hands clamped over the baby's ears. Arthur didn't stay pinned. He knew a static defense was a death sentence against superior numbers. As the outlaws reloaded, Arthur slipped out the back window of the cabin, dropping silently into the freezing mud. He used the raging storm as his cover, circling wide through the pine trees. This was his mountain. These town drunks and hired guns were merely trespassing on his domain. Deacon Miller was creeping along the side of the cabin, trying to get an angle on the back door. He never heard Arthur coming. A massive hand clamped over Deacon's mouth, and the butt of Arthur's Colt revolver came down hard on his temple, dropping the man cold into the brush. 2 down, 2 to go. But as Arthur moved to flank Wyatt, his boot snapped a submerged branch. Wyatt spun, firing blindly into the trees. A searing, white-hot pain ripped through Arthur's left side just below his ribs. He grunted, stumbling against a pine trunk, pressing his hand to the wound. Blood, hot and thick, poured through his fingers. Hearing the gunshot, Rust seized the opportunity. He kicked in the front door of the cabin, his boots stomping across the shattered wood. "Where are you, you little witch?" Rust spat, tearing the cabin apart. Underneath the floorboards, Samuel, startled by the tremendous crash above, let out a piercing wail. Josie gasped, trying to soothe him, but it was too late. Above her, the heavy boots stopped. The braided rug was ripped away. The trapdoor was violently yanked open, and the ugly, rain-slicked face of Jebediah Rust sneered down at her in the lantern light. "Well, well, found the prize," Rust laughed, pointing his rusted revolver down at her face. "Time on up, girl. Leave the rat down there." Josie looked at the barrel of the gun, then down at the baby in her arms. The fear that had ruled her for months evaporated, replaced by a fierce maternal rage. She was not a victim anymore. "I said come up," Rust yelled, leaning down to grab her hair. Josie stood up onto the first step, but instead of reaching for his hand, she grabbed a heavy glass mason jar filled with preserved blackberries from the shelf beside her. With a primal scream, she smashed the jar directly into Rust's face. Glass shattered. Dark berry juice and blood exploded across Rust's eyes. He howled in agony, dropping his gun and touching his lacerated face, stumbling backward over the wooden cradle. At that exact moment, Arthur breached the front door. He was pale, covered in mud and his own blood, breathing heavily. Wyatt, who had rushed in behind Rust, raised his rifle to finish the wounded giant. But Arthur was faster. With a lightning-fast draw that defied his massive size, Arthur fired his Colt twice. Wyatt dropped instantly. Rust, half-blinded and screaming, tried to scramble toward his fallen gun. Arthur crossed the room in 2 massive strides, grabbed Rust by the back of his heavy canvas coat, and hurled him straight through the front window. Rust landed in the mud outside, broken, bleeding, and utterly defeated. The cabin fell dead silent, save for the howling wind and the crying baby. Arthur stood swaying in the center of the room, his revolver hanging loosely from his hand. He looked down into the cellar. Josie was staring up at him, her chest heaving, the unbroken half of the glass jar still gripped in her bleeding hand. "You all right, little bird?" Arthur managed to wheeze out. "I'm all right," Josie breathed. Arthur offered her a weak smile. Then his eyes rolled back, and the ghost of the bighorns collapsed onto the floorboards with a heavy thud. The next 48 hours were a blur of blood, boiling water, and desperate prayers. Josie dragged Arthur's massive frame onto the better feet of adrenaline-fueled strength she didn't know she possessed. She found his medical kit, stripped away his blood-soaked buckskins, and examined the wound. The bullet had passed clean through his side, missing his vital organs but leaving a nasty bleeding channel. She cleaned the wound with high-proof whiskey, ignoring Arthur's unconscious groans, and packed it with yarrow and clean linen. She sat by his side for 2 days and 2 nights, only leaving to feed Samuel and drag the tied-up, groaning outlaws into the livery shed out back so they wouldn't freeze to death before she could figure out what to do with them. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke, revealing a brilliant, crisp autumn sun. Arthur opened his eyes. The fever had broken. He found Josie asleep in the wooden chair beside his bed, her head resting near his arm, her hand resting near his arm, her hand loosely gripping his massive fingers. He squeezed her hand gently. She snapped awake, her eyes wide. "You're awake," she breathed, tears immediately pooling in her eyes. "You foolish, stubborn old bear. You almost died. Takes more than a town drunk to kill a mountain man." Arthur rasped, his throat dry. He looked at her, truly looking at the dirt on her face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the fierce protective set of her jaw. "You saved my life, Josie. You fought back. You gave me something worth fighting for," she replied softly. Arthur looked away, the old shame creeping back in. "Josie, when I'm healed, I'll take those men down to the marshal in Cheyenne, and I'll buy you that train ticket. You don't have to stay here and nurse a broken-down barren hermit." Josie stood up. She walked over to the cradle, picked up a cooing Samuel, and brought him over to the bed. She placed the baby gently on Arthur's uninjured chest. Arthur instinctively wrapped his massive arms around the child. "Arthur Pendleton," Josie said, her voice steady and echoing with absolute certainty. "I am not getting on a train. I am not going anywhere. You told me once that you were a dead branch on a family tree.